No material for books has perhaps a higher claim to antiquity than the skin of the calf or goat, tanned soft and which usually was dyed red or yellow. The skins, when thus prepared, were most often connected in lengths sometimes of 100 feet, sufficient to contain an entire work, or one book of a history or treatise, which then formed a roll or volume.
Lay it on the table. Yes, sire.
These soft skins seem to have been more in use among the Jews and other Asiatics than among the people of Europe. The copies of the Hebrew scriptures found in the synagogues of the Jews are often of this kind. The most ancient manuscripts still existing are some copies of the Pentateuch on rolls of crimson leather. Parchment, pergamena, so called long after the time of its first use, from Pergamus, a city of Mysia, where the manufacture was improved and carried on to a great extent, is mentioned by Herodotus and Ctesias as a material which had been, from time immemorial, used for books. It has proved itself to be, of all others except that above mentioned, the most durable. The greater part of all those manuscripts, now in our hands, that are of a higher antiquity than the 6th century, are on parchment, as well as generally all carefully written and curiously decorated manuscripts of later times. The palimpsests mentioned in the preceding chapter are usually parchments. The practice, which is still followed in the East, of writing upon the leaves of trees is of great antiquity. The leaves of the mallow, or the palm, were those the most used for this purpose. Sometimes they were wrought together so as to form larger surfaces, but it is probable that so fragile and inconvenient a material was employed rather for ordinary purposes of business, letter writing, and the instruction of children, rather than for books intended for preservation. The inner bark of the linden or teal tree, and perhaps of some others, called by the Romans liber, and by the Greeks biblos, was so generally used as material for writing as to have given its name to a book in both languages. Tables of solid wood called codices, whence the term codex for a manuscript on any material has passed into common use, were also employed, but this was chiefly for legal documents, on which account a system of laws came to be called a code. Leaves or tablets of lead or of ivory are frequently mentioned by ancient authors as in common use for writing, but no material or preparation seems to have been so frequently employed on ordinary occasions as tablets covered with a thin coat of colored wax, which might be readily removed by an iron needle called a style, and from which the writing was easily effaced by applying the blunt end of the same instrument. But during many ages, the article most in use, and of which the consumption was so great as to form a principal branch of the commerce of the Mediterranean, was that which was manufactured from the papyrus of Egypt. Many manuscripts written upon this kind of paper in the 6th and some even so early as the 4th century are still in existence. It formed the material of by far the larger proportion of all books from very early times till about the 7th or 8th century, when it gradually gave place to a still more convenient manufacture, our modern paper. The papyrus, or reed of Egypt, grew in vast quantities in the stagnant pools that were formed by the annual inundations of the Nile. The plant consists of a single stem, rising sometimes to the height of 10 cubits. This stem, gradually tapering from the root, supports a spreading tuft at its summit. The substance of the stem is fibrous, and the pith contains a sweet juice. Every part of this plant was put to some use by the Egyptians, so ingenious and so industrious as they were. The harder and lower part they formed into cups and other utensils, the upper part into staves or the ribs of boats. The sweet pith was a common article of food, while the fibrous part of the stem was manufactured into cloth, sails for ships, ropes, strings, shoes, baskets, wicks for lamps, and especially into paper. For this purpose, the fibrous coats of the plant were peeled off throughout the whole length of the stem. One layer of the fibers was then laid across another upon a block, and being moistened, the glutinous juice of the plant formed a cement, sufficiently strong to give coherence to the fibers. When greater solidity was required, a size made from bread or glue was employed. The two films, being thus connected, were pressed, dried in the sun, beaten with a broad mallet, and then polished with a shell. This texture was cut into various sizes according to the use for which it was intended, varying from 13 to 4 fingers' breadth and of proportionate length. By progressive improvements, which were made especially when the manufacture came into the hands of the Roman artists, the Egyptian paper was at length brought to a high degree of perfection. In later ages, it was made of considerable thickness, perfect whiteness, and an entire continuity and smoothness of surface. Nevertheless, it was, at the best, so friable or crumbly that when durability was required, the copyist inserted a page of parchment between every 5 or 6 pages of the papyrus. Thus, the firmness of the one substance defended the brittleness of the other. A great number of books constituted in this manner have resisted the accidents and decay of 12 centuries. 300 years before the Christian era, the commerce in the paper of Egypt had extended over most parts of the civilized world, and long afterwards it continued to be a principal source of wealth to the Egyptians. But at length, the invention of another material, and also that interruption of commerce which ensued in consequence of the conquest of Egypt by the Saracens, banished the Egyptian paper from common use. Comparatively few manuscripts on this material are found of later date than the 8th or 9th century, although it continued to be occasionally used long afterwards. The Charta Bambicina, or cotton paper, which has often improperly been called silk paper, had unquestionably been manufactured in the East as early as the 9th century, and probably much earlier, and in the 10th century it came into general use throughout Europe. Not long afterwards, this invention was made still more available for general purposes by the substitution of old linen or cotton rags for the raw material, for by this means both the price of the article was reduced and its quality greatly improved. The cotton paper manufactured in the ancient mode is still used in the East and is a beautiful fabric. It is also extensively used in the United States. From this account of the materials successively employed for books, it would be obvious that a knowledge of the changes which these several manufacturers underwent from age to age will often make it easy, and especially when employed in subservience to other evidence, to fix with certainty the date of manuscripts, or at the least, to furnish infallible means for detecting fabricated documents. The preservation of books, framed as they are of materials so destructible through a period of 12 or even 1,500 years, is a fact which might seem almost incredible, especially so as the decay of far more durable substances within a much shorter period is continually presented to our notice. Yet so it is, that while the massive walls of the monasteries of the Middle Ages are often seen crumbling and their materials fast mingling with the soil, the manuscripts penned within them, or perhaps at a time when these stones were yet in the quarry, are still fair and perfect, and glitter with their gold and silver, their cerulean and their cinnabar. It must be remembered, however, that the materials of books, although destructible, are so far from being in themselves perishable, that so long as they are defended from positive injuries, they appear to suffer scarcely at all from any intrinsic principle of decay, or to be liable to any perceptible process of chemical decomposition. No one, says Mabillon, unless totally unacquainted with what relates to antiquity, can call in question the great durability of parchment, since there still exists innumerable books written on that material in the 7th and 6th centuries, and some of a still more remote antiquity, by which all doubt on that subject might be removed. It may suffice here to mention the Virgil of the Vatican Library, which appears to be of more ancient date than the 4th century, and another in the King's Library, little less ancient. Also the Prudentius, in the same library of equal age, to which you may add several already mentioned, as the Psalter of St. Germanus, the Book of the Councils, and others, which are all of parchment. The paper of Egypt, being more frail and brittle, might be open to greater doubt, and yet there are books of great antiquity by which its durability may be established. Books have owed their conservation not merely to the durability of the material of which they were formed, but to the peculiarity of their being, at once precious, and yet in periods of general ignorance, not marketable articles. They were of inestimable value to a few, while absolutely worthless in the opinion of the multitude. They were also indebted for their preservation in periods of disorder and violence to the sacredness of the roofs under which they were lodged. I chose this passage because making paper is one of my favorite pastimes, if you know what I mean. In all seriousness, this was an interesting read and I learned a few things. Number one, the practice of writing upon tree leaves is of great antiquity. This is very valuable information. I didn't know anybody ever wrote on leaves, and some would say it's far too primitive. But these days, I often feel an inner urge to leave the city and rediscover my roots in the jungle. Now I know when I get there how to send letters. Number two, the inner bark of the linden or teal tree was called by the Romans liber, in the Greeks biblos. Might we contemplate how close the word book is to liberty or liberal arts? This type of phonetic pattern recognition is of great use to the seeker. According to the fabled French alchemist Fulcanelli, quote, "Often we pass by a phenomenon, or a miracle even, without noticing it, like men blind and deaf. What unsuspected marvels we should find if we knew how to dissect words, to strip them of their bark and liberate the spirit, the divine light which is within." End quote. We must pay attention to words and the patterns within them, both the spelling and the sound. Number three, the substance of the papyrus stem is fibrous and the pith contains a sweet juice. To think that the same plant that is used to record peace agreements with rival nations, to build ships that sail the world, the same plant gives those diplomats and those shipbuilders a little treat to eat. 'Tis poetry, my friends, in quite colorful theater. It's lovely. Number four, knowledge of the changes in how paper was manufactured over time. This is the key that gives us a way to date documents as well as expose fakes. Makes sense. And you know, we are interested in exposing fakes. Number five, books, scrolls, documents all owe their long lifespans not merely from the material that they were made of, but because of their, quote, peculiarity of being precious. And most importantly, the sacredness of the roofs under which they were lodged. I wonder, will our modern digital record-keeping technology be as durable as paper has proved? How long will this video last, for instance? Well, it seems everything comes down to the sacredness of the holder, so we can only hope that the tech depositories are aware of the obligation they are charged with. Lastly, before we go, try to remember, friends, we're living in the golden age of knowledge, and that with the proper commitment and sacrifice to developing our abilities, we can accomplish anything. Till next time.